Hi, I'm Christopher Annadale. I've tracked down some of my former students to ask, is there life after philosophy? Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Lexi Pintar, née Zambito. She is a 2022 graduate of Mount St. Mary's University with a bachelor's degree and a triple major in theology, philosophy, and Latin. She is expecting her first child later this month. Lexi, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's so great to see you again. I saw you last about 6 months ago at Emma Belsky's wedding. That's Emma
Mhm.
Weinheimer, whom I interviewed for episode 2 of this podcast. And you were a classmate of hers here at the Mount. And as I just mentioned, you're right on the cusp of a major life change. You're at the almost at the peak of the roller coaster, I might say, of being a mom and dealing with a baby and children, and then later toddlers and everything else. How do you look at your philosophy education from the perspective of where you are now and where you think you'll be in the years to come?
Oh gosh. Well, looking back at my philosophy, major, I see, first of all, how it helped me when I was in the workforce. So I recently, as of this past Friday, resigned from my last job. I don't intend on going back after the baby is born, but I think my philosophy major in that helped me transition from, being a full-time student. And I had gone to Catholic school all my life, like preschool up through college Catholic school. And it was kind of, a bit of a transition, going into the secular workforce and just trying to figure out how do I, be an exemplar of, my values, not only as a Catholic, but also just showing the intellectual, integrity, the life well lived that we know is so important. And that afforded me the opportunity to kind of like push back against the whole idea of a work life balance. That was something my previous company, kind of like sold themselves as having a really good work life balance, which is fair. I mean, they, in the sense that they mean, they certainly were very flexible when, anything came up, but there was this idea that, you would go to work for 40 hours a week or 8 hours a day, whatever. And then that was very isolated from the rest of your life. And when I started, I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense because I know from my philosophy education and everything else that work is a very, integral part of the human person. So it's not like I spend 40 hours of my week at this company doing these things and like that magically has no bearing on the rest of my life, or that it doesn't, that somehow like the me at work was different than the me not at work. So that was something I really had to work through, intellectually, and also try to share with my coworkers, that like our work still has meaning, even if it wasn't, what we like our dream job or something like that. But it's like the work that we do here really does, impact and influence the kinds of people that we are. It would be impossible for you to spend that much time each week doing something and it to not somehow affect your personality. So it's like if this is going to have such a big place in your life, you better be doing it well, or else you're going to negatively influence yourself as a person. And so now coming out of that, and being able to transition into the role of, just kind of being a homemaker, and being with my child, that's a lot easier to it's a lot easier for me then to see how that kind of work like really is bound up in who I am as a person. But I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to kind of do the the corporate setting, the kind of work that maybe necessarily doesn't that I wasn't too keen on doing, and just having an opportunity to really still let my work be formative for myself, so I think that has prepared me then to step into this role where, of course, the kind of work I will be doing in the home is, really bound up with like who I am as a person, and, really just directly impacts my vocation as a wife and as a mother.
This is a speculative question, but do you suppose that in an alternate timeline you could have found a fulfilling life in the kind of work that you were doing and would have been doing?
Well, I think it would have been what I made it. So I think it could have been fulfilling if I'm not saying it wasn't in certain ways, but at the end of the day, I honestly know. I'm not sure
Okay.
it would have been ultimately fulfilling for me just because, it was not in a field that I was particularly interested in. And, I had always known, especially of course once I got married, that our ultimate goal was for us to have a family, ideally to homeschool. So of course I would be doing that.
Right.
And so with those kinds of goals, anything else would kind of pale in comparison to the ultimate calling of my vocation, which is to, the primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. So there was nothing I could have done work wise that ever could have been higher than that.
That's a good answer. Thank you. You mentioned your conversations with your coworkers. Do you feel like in your brief time in the secular work world, you had a good effect on some of the people that you interacted with?
I'd like to think so. I did have the fortune of genuinely the people I worked with, we did become friends over time. Most of them were not, none of them were Catholic, but a lot of them were Christian. So we were at least kind of working most of the time on the same basic, you know, worldview. But I remember one day I was in a meeting and someone brought up the point of like pretending at your job if you don't feel like doing your job, or if you don't feel like doing a good job at it, just like acting and kind of putting on a show. And I was like, no, like that's not, like I understand the value in faking it until you make it in some circumstances, but I was like, you can't pretend to be someone else. Like I said, for 40 hours a week, which it would essentially be a lie, and then have that not, you know, not impact you in a certain way. Because then if you start putting on a farce in this one aspect of your life, then it would be very easy for you to fall into doing that in other aspects of your life. And the terrible thing about pretending or lying about certain aspects of who you are is the fact that eventually you don't even know anymore what's true and what's not for you. And I think when I brought that up, someone was like, that's a good point. I was like, thank you. As long as I got that through to to one person, that that you can't just fake your life and have it, and have that be a positive thing. And like I said, just the whole idea that your work is separate from your life, I tried to, when I could, just make the point that no, like this is our life. It's not like, at the end of your life, you magically get all of that time that you spent at work back because it just like wasn't somehow your life. And like, this is your life. These hours are, counting against you, in the grand scheme of thing, and the grand amount of time that you have. So it's just really important to use it well. And I think, I don't know if everyone agreed with me, but I think that they at least saw where I was coming from, or could understand where I was coming from.
Thank you. I remember speaking a little while ago with Alex Wakaluk, whom you might remember if your time overlapped with his. And he had mentioned on the podcast that his philosophy education, he thought, helped him to recognize that he needed to make a career change. He was in a job doing work that he thought was not good, not good objectively and not good for him. So he was miserable and had to get out. And he said he thought perhaps if he hadn't have had the philosophy formation he had, he wouldn't have recognized that as quickly and made the change that he needed to make. It sounds like you're speaking here also to this important element of integration, of regarding all of your life as being a whole and seeking to value that whole being now for you really connected with the prospect of being a mom, of taking care of children, doing all the sort of the daily things that need to be done. How does that look for you now that, from the perspective of, like I said, somebody right at the top of the roller coaster before the plunge?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because again, you don't know what to expect if you don't, I've obviously this is the first time I've done any of this, for myself. And,
It's a big
you know,
change.
I yeah, I do have the fortune of I do have I have three older sisters. They all have children, so I've kind of watched them go through this go through this process, which of course is helpful, but there's only so much that observing other people can get you. And there are even certain aspects of, you know, being being a mom or a homemaker that I even now I kind of wonder, or I struggle to find the value in, even though I know that it has value. But, at the end of my life, is it really going to matter that I, you know, mopped my floors once a week or that I changed X number of diapers and whatever? But then I have to remind myself it seems like to me, from what I've observed, that the virtue and the holiness that comes from living out one's vocation as a wife and as a mother comes from the very mundane and almost hidden tasks that, it's like you are in your house, you're not in out in the world doing grand things. Not that I was before, but it was at least a little more public. But I have to remind myself that, these little things that I do, such as, keeping my house like a clean and pleasant place to live for my family, and making good food for everyone, and then eventually, teaching my kids their numbers and letters, that really is it is really a very high calling. I mean, you think about the Blessed Mother, like she lived a very hidden life.
Right.
And, I can assume that she was the one who made the food and cleaned and did everything. And I think that in today's society, there is just an idea that if you are not doing very grand things in a very public space, that what you're doing doesn't have value. But a lot of times it truly is the little things that you do and that accumulate, over your life. How many times am I going to make dinner in my life? I guess we could do the math, but it's going to be a lot.
Thousands of
Um,
times, yes.
it feels very mundane, but
Mhm.
then, I can look back one day and say, well, look at how well I fed my kids and my husband and made sure that they never had to worry about, you know, what they were going to eat or if they were being, taken care of. So like you said, it is a little bit daunting to think about how much my life is going to really transition into being very hidden, and how much of what I do that has value is seemingly very going to be mundane. But it does seem to me like that's kind of where the holiness and the, of the whole thing lies.
I think you're right about that. You've mentioned religion, you've mentioned the Blessed Mother, and it certainly is true. One way to think about the hiddenness of one's life and the value is to think of that kind of exemplar, and there is no higher or better exemplar than her. Is there a philosophical element to this, though? Is there a way in which, thinking just for a moment specifically as a philosopher, you might think of the value of the private versus the public, and maybe a sort of implicit critique of the way in which our society tends to overvalue the public and the economic, the producing of spreadsheets, which honestly don't seem like they're a whole lot more meaningful than mopping floors in a larger context, but they have a certain kind of public value that can be spoken of, where it seems like in our time the private, the provision for the household, it doesn't have as much social and cultural prestige built into it. What do you think of that?
Well, when you mentioned that, it just made me think about Pieper. Of course, leisure is the basis of culture. That's just where my mind went. And gosh, it's been a long time since I have read that. But it seems to me that because there is so much of a focus on the economic and on productivity, our society certainly does not have a good grasp on what true leisure is. I mean, you can see that in the United States. I mean, of course, we are a relatively young country with a lot of different ethnic groups, so it's very hard to, come up with a kind of homogenous culture. But, even in smaller communities now, it's very difficult to find like a flourishing cultural life. And you can look at examples that we have in the media or or the books that are being written now. They're just not, you know they're just very empty. I mean there are some, certainly some good ones, but we're certainly not living in an age that I think will be one day looked back on for its artistic production. And I think then, so there is value then in focusing on that hidden life, one that is very kind of removed from all of the economic hustle and bustle. And of course, the home is, the domestic economy, is one thing. And there's no way for us to ever be fully separate, of course, from the wider economy and the wider culture. But
Mhm.
I think that for me, like the families that I know, like the um the Catholic families who really focus on teaching their children, raising them at home, raising them in a good environment. It's like that, those are the people who really get to experience what culture is supposed to be like, because then you have time to focus on, the works of the Western canon. Or I think about the homeschooling families. I know you've mentioned this to me before, how you read The Lord of the Rings to your children.
Right.
Not a lot of people do that. So I think that, this does give me an opportunity to kind of imbue, my own children with the Western culture that is, very quickly, well, I would say probably has already fully disintegrated, and to kind of bring that back into their consciousness, knowing that that's going to make them better people than if I had, than if we were all more out in the world and they were being influenced by other cultural phenomena, such as, whatever they see on TikTok, or, whatever kind of music is being produced now, which is like I,
Not good.
certainly not like Mozart or anything like that. So yeah, I think that this kind of hidden life has the virtue of allowing you to kind of tune out all of the the noise and the things that are not conducive to living virtuously or to living a good life, and really focus on those things that have proven over the centuries and over millennia to actually help people live a life well lived.
Let's talk about the value of community because you've mentioned your sisters, seeing your older sisters raise kids is a bit of a preparation. And it also seems like having a certain society of people doing something similar to what you're doing, raising their kids, educating their kids, worshiping God, engaging in a kind of shared leisure activities as well, seems to be really important to living well. One can't live well without those things. Do you have a good community of people around you now that you learn from and contribute to? And do you feel you had a community like that back in college during your education?
Well, I certainly had that in college, and I'm fortunate enough to have two of my very good friends from the Mount who live in the same, we all live in the DC area, so I get to see them very frequently, which is great. But both my husband and I, we live relatively far away from our family. So he's from Idaho. So of course they're like across the country. I'm from Pennsylvania, so my family is within driving distance, but certainly not, you know, I mean, it's a trip that, you really have to plan to make. That has been a bit of a challenge, for us just trying to identify ways that we can be supported, especially, without the immediate presence of our families. And also, some people have the very good fortune to have families that they're very close to. That's not necessarily the case for the both of us either. But, at our parish, we have, had the pleasure to meet a lot of young adults who are very, yeah, just very sold on the faith, and they really see the value in what we're doing, even if they don't have children themselves. We've only lived here. Well, I've only lived here for about 10 months since we got married, so a little bit less than a year. So it has been a blessing, though, to be able to find people our own age who really do have the same kind of ideas for life as we do. Even if they are kind of in a different stage. But I've already had people start to bring us food and offer to, start meal trains or come over to help me clean the house, once the baby is here. So we have been very blessed in that. But I mean, it certainly is very challenging to find community. I mean, I think, of course, going to mass at the same place on a regular basis seems to be, one of the primary ways that you find that community, because you're naturally going to find like-minded people. And I think that it's one of the last places in our life where you go regularly, where you see the same people. It's not like everyone loves to go to Europe because they think it's so cute, because everyone walks to the market and they see their friends, and they just talk to them. But like that's just how life is supposed to be, but that's simply not how the infrastructure of our country is set up
Right.
to allow us to, frequent places and be able to, form like long lasting connections with other people in our community, because we are also isolated. Yeah. So without going to mass, I'm really not sure, how we would have found that community.
That reminds me of something somebody said to me once, that the part of the attraction of small liberal arts colleges may be that their campuses represent some of the last walkable community space in a world that's dominated by suburbs and by car transport, that you really are around the same people and in proximity to the same couple of hundred people for a significant amount of your day. And you can go to all the places you need to go, often just on foot without having to spend time in traffic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true, especially having gone to the Mount, which is very, very small. Like, I'm very fortunate that I had the experience, of living in a place like that where I could walk everywhere. If you go to Patriot for breakfast at 8 a.m. every day, you're gonna usually see the same people, like who's gonna be there. And also just allows you the opportunity to go outside. Like, when I was
Mhm.
working, like I had to make an effort to actually go outside on a walk, because you start in your house, you have the commute to work, you're in the office, you drive home, and then by that point it's the evening time, and that's just not how people were made to live.
You're absolutely right about that. If you don't mind my asking one more question, I wonder what your perspective is on marrying and starting a family young. I don't know how old you are, but you are just 2 years past college, and here you are on the edge of motherhood. My oldest son just got married last year at the age of 23. And I only mention these things because it's been observed the past decade or two that there's been a trend towards later and later marriage, with people waiting until their late 20s or the early 30s even to get married and start a family. Do you have any thoughts or perspective on that, either through your own experience or just as a general observation about the kind of culture that we live in today?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on it. So I got married at 23. I'm just about to turn 24. So yeah, I got married just about like almost exactly a year after I graduated from the Mount. My husband is he's 2 years older than me, so he's 26. But getting married young was not something that I really had envisioned for myself, or at least getting married as quickly as I can. My husband and I were engaged less than a year after we had first met each other. And, before that was me, I thought that people were crazy who did that. There's like, how could you marry someone and only know them for a year? But, things happen and when you know. And I think that there is this idea that you have to be dating or, whatever, be in a relationship with someone for years before you get married in order to really know them. And I just don't think that I don't see the logic in that, because I don't think it's very difficult to figure out if you're supposed to marry someone or not. And I think a lot of times people they they want something out of the person that they're dating that they don't have yet, but they don't want to leave. I think a lot of like a lot of modern culture is really driven by fear, but especially a lot of modern dating culture, because it's like if you leave this person, then it's like, oh no, who are you going to date? But I think, for us, by the time that Jacob and I met, we had both had enough life experience where we both knew what we wanted. We knew that we wanted to get married, and we decided, because we dated long distance, so we met online. So I didn't even know him in person. And when when he was planning to come meet me for the first time, it was kind of like, okay, we're gonna see, either like, yes, we see value in pursuing this and we could see us marrying each other, or, if it doesn't work out, we're just gonna say see ya, never talk to each other again. And then that's gonna be it. And thankfully for the both of us, when we met, it was pretty clear to the both of us that there was a good chance that it was going to work out. So then, we pursued a relationship with each other. And yeah, like you said, not something that I thought of myself doing. I definitely thought that after graduation from the Mount, that I was going to go to school. I thought I was at least going to have like a master's degree before I got married. And then when I met Jacob, it's like, well, that would be silly of me to kind of leave behind this person and go in pursuit of higher education, because and I had some pushback, especially from members of my family who thought maybe that I was throwing away good academic prospects for the sake of getting married. But I said to them, I was like, look, marriage is, besides, getting to heaven is like our first vocation, but then our primary vocation is either marriage or religious life. And then after that comes our vocation as, a student or a worker, whatever. So it's like I have my primary vocation sitting right in front of me. My first obligation is always going to be to that. So that's kind of why, I decided, not to get a master's degree or whatever, and just to work for a little bit. Because of course, getting married takes money, and, you have to have something to live off of. So yeah, so it was quite a change of life plan for me. But, I think that people have to remember that, if they are called to marriage, that's your first obligation to pursue. And I'm not saying that you have to go on dates every night of the week to try to find your spouse, because usually, well, at least how it happened for me, it kind of just fell in front of me when I wasn't even looking, and in that sense, it felt very providential. And I think too, when my husband and I got married, I also we both got some pushback from our respective families about getting married at the age we did. And then when we announced that we were expecting, about having a child when we are, my husband is still in law school, so he's, not working at a firm full time yet. And then especially when I told him I was going to stay at home, everyone thought that we were crazy. Um, but it's one of those things where I think getting married young has the benefit of, you are mature enough and responsible enough to deal with the challenges of marriage and having a child. But when you're young, you also tend to be a little bit foolish. So it's like maybe I think that our Lord designed us that way where, young people are, just foolish enough that they can actually, you know, trust that these sorts of things will work out. I think that if I was, maybe 30 and had gotten married and was in the exact same situation, I think I probably would be a lot more reticent to quit my job and, live off of only one income while one of us is still in school. So I think that when you're young, you're built to take risks, but a lot of people take risks in the form of, you know, other things that might not necessarily be the best for them. But this is the sort of risk, that I think is actually worth taking, of having a child and not really knowing how it's going to work out or what's going to happen or how we're going to pay rent in 5 months.
Hmm.
But you just have to trust. I mean, the first commandment that we get in the Bible is to be fruitful and multiply. You just have to trust that what the Lord has said is good for your life will actually be the best thing for your life.
Do you think that having a child is an act of hope?
And yeah, absolutely. I think especially now when we see people choosing to not have children because of, they cite the state of the world or the environment, et cetera. Like all the reasons. I mean, there are a million reasons to not have a child. I mean, if you think about the potential suffering that they could undergo, potential illnesses that they could have, whatever. I mean, you could come up with a million reasons for not doing something, for not having a child specifically. But yeah, I mean, having a child, it's hopeful in the sense of like I think of the ancient Israelites, like they saw having a child as, like an extension of themselves. That's how you literally extended your own life and your own lineage, which was why, barrenness was viewed as, such a curse, in the Old Testament, such a bad thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I always wonder when people, do not want to have children for any of the above mentioned reasons. It's like it's such a denial of the natural instinct to, extend your own life. And I mean, I can imagine it would be a great joy to not only see your children, but then like in the nuptial mass in the extraordinary form, it always says something like that you may see your children's children to the third and fourth generation. And
Right.
I was talking with my dad the other week, kind of about this whole concept. And he said to me, he has, how many grandchildren now? He said he was like, having a child is, great and wonderful. But he was like, having grandchildren is just something like totally different. He's like, I can't even describe what it's like, to see all of my grandchildren around me. So I think it's not only an act of hope that, your own life will be, sort of propagated and extended in a certain way, but it's also, I mean, of course, it's just a hope for the future. That's why we have children to keep the human race going. But, I have hope that even though the world is not maybe the most ideal place, it never has been and it never will be. And we know that. So I don't think that that's a good reason, to not have these children that God has asked us to.
Hmm.
And of course, with each child comes, a brand new life, someone who is perfectly innocent, someone who is perfectly, children are so amazing because they are very close to the Lord.
Hmm.
Our Lord loves children. He always says, I think of Therese of Lisieux. I recently read Story of a Soul, and she always is citing like verses from Proverbs and from the Old Testament where our Lord talks about how we are supposed to be like little children, and only the little ones can come to me. And we can also learn so much from other people's children, but I would imagine, especially from living with your own children, that virtue of childlikeness that we are supposed to have in relation to the Lord. And I do anticipate that it will be very I think it'll be a very interesting experience for, me, and especially for me to see my husband with our children, because really the first place that kids see modeled the love of God the Father is through their parents, but I think especially through their own father. And I do very much so look forward to seeing how my husband will love them selflessly. And I think that that is going to do a lot for me in my own knowledge of how God the Father loves me and, loves each of us.
That's marvelous and beautifully said. Thank you, Lexi. I really appreciate that. My own experience has been that you do care about the future in a different way when you're a parent than before. It's not necessarily to the moral discredit of anybody who's not a parent, but there seems to be something profoundly different that you can't truly prepare for. I remember some years ago when a colleague of mine was about to have their first child. I told them there's really no advice I can give you because it's a unique experience that you learn it by living through it. If I may, let me ask you a version of the final question of the show, which is about advice you might give to current college students or even high school students. And I'll specifically ask you here about young women, perhaps in your position from 5 or 6 years ago. If they're considering the study of philosophy, whether to minor or major in philosophy or simply take an elective course, what kind of advice could you give them based upon the perspective that you have now?
Yeah, I mean, I've never regretted majoring in philosophy. If I could do it again, I certainly would. The thing that I suppose I appreciate about my philosophy education the most is that, of course, it teaches you how to think. A lot of fields teach you a very specific skill set or just what to think, but philosophy genuinely does teach you how to think, and also just how to have a very integrated worldview. I remember in our Foundations of Philosophy class that I had with Dr. Hochschild, that was the first time that I really came to understand knowledge as this cohesive whole that, of course, is centered in God, but before I had viewed, different fields like as each having their own set of facts, like science is over here, and then we have the truths of the faith over here. And I didn't really see how they related so much, but it was really in that first philosophy class that I saw how it all comes together, and that we're not just going after a set of individual dogmas to follow, but it's you're going after an entire worldview, which is what is so amazing and but also so challenging, not only about philosophy, but then also about theology and like living from a Catholic perspective, is that everything influences everything else. It's very, you can't isolate one thing from another. And I'm thankful that I learned that in philosophy, because now, when I was, like I said, I did go to Catholic school all my life, but I was never presented with the information or with knowledge like that. I kind of, it was like, we had religion class over here, and that didn't really have much of a bearing on anything else that we did. So I'm thankful that I had this experience so that now when I'm raising my own children, I can, now I have no idea how I'm going to do this with a 3-year-old, but I can at least try to, make them aware that knowledge and the truth, there aren't separate fields of knowledge that aren't related to each other. Everything is integrated, everything is one cohesive whole. And then that, I think in turn, I think that philosophy then in that way really shows you how to live, and why having an integrity of life is really, is really important. We already discussed like kind of like the relationship between work and the self, that you cannot separate your work from who you are as a person. You can't separate, your knowledge from who you are as a person. And of course, every action that you do, either genuinely does either positively or negatively form yourself as a person. And what I appreciate about philosophy is that it really is, I mean, of course, it's the love of wisdom, it's the pursuit of wisdom, but it does emphasize, I think, how you have to continually form yourself as a person. And then, also, for me, I have the responsibility of, forming a new life. And like I said, I'm, never, I think no one is quite prepared, as you said, for how you're going to do that exactly. And then the other thing about philosophy that I was thinking of is, it forms your mind and it teaches you how to think, and no one can ever take your mind from you unless you let them. But your intellect and then your soul, those are forever. Those are never going to leave you. And so I think, why would you not invest the time in really forming your intellect, especially I think doing like studying philosophy in college is amazing because you do have a very structured format for doing that. And ideally, as I did at the Mount with professors, who live that kind of integrated life, with a lot of integrity, that's very important. So to me, it's like there's no reason why you shouldn't study theology because, he said you're no one can ever take your mind or your knowledge from you. And, and then in turn, no one can take your integrity from you unless you let them. So, why would you not, invest in that?
Great. Thank you so much. My guest today has been Lexi Pintar, a 2022 graduate of Mount St. Mary's University. Lexi, thank you for being with us and sharing all your thoughts today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.